Hi, it's me, Tim Dodd, the Everyday Astronaut. I'm in Mississippi at the Infinity Science Center, just outside of NASA's Stennis Space Center, and I'm here to check out a rocket engine. A rocket engine is really just a heat and pressure machine that needs to convert that heat and pressure into workable thrust. The more it can convert, the better. This conversion is usually done by a really large bell nozzle. I mean, after all, that's the only job for every single centimeter of this entire thing. The further down in this nozzle you go, the lower the pressure and temperature gets. So that means it's exchanged for higher and higher exhaust gas velocity. So in general, you want this nozzle to be as big as possible so you can convert as much of that energy as you can. Only one problem. If you lower the exhaust pressure too much, the ambient air pressure will actually squeeze in so much it'll peel the exhaust off the walls of the nozzle. And that could actually form these random shock waves and spikes that can destroy the engine. So what if you took a rocket engine and you turned it inside out so that the ambient air pressure wasn't peeling the exhaust off the nozzle walls, it's actually pushing the exhaust in against the nozzle walls? Well, that's the theory behind the Aerospike engine. Not only does it do exactly this, it also promises to increase engine efficiency at all altitudes because that inside-out nozzle forms a nearly perfect shape for the exhaust to follow, which makes it more efficient throughout ascent. And with engineers relentlessly trying to optimize rockets in a world where even a 1% improvement is a massive leap, the Aerospike engine seems like a dream come true. Throughout history, there's actually been a number of Aerospikes that have made it really far into development, but to date, none have ever really flown, let alone been used on an orbital class rocket. If they're so good, why isn't everyone using them? Or for that fact, why isn't anyone using them? Why aren't these brand new engines like SpaceX's Raptor engine that are built from the ground up? Why aren't they Aerospikes? So today we're going to look at the history of the Aerospike engine, and then we're going to look at how nozzles work, including things like overexpansion, underexpansion, and expansion ratios. Then we'll look at the pros, the cons, the physical limitations, and the problems of the Aerospike engine. Then we're going to compare the Aerospike to other traditional rocket engines. But that's not all. I actually got some never before seen photos and videos of some historical Aerospike engines. Then I talked to some people who actually have worked with and engineered Aerospike engines. Then we're going to look at some compelling concepts and promising prospects for some future Aerospike engines. And hopefully by the end of this video, we'll know whether or not the holy grail of rockets is just waiting to be utilized, or if they're just simply not worth it. So put on your favorite Aerospike engine t-shirt, grab some popcorn, a drink, and a notepad, because this is a really long video and we have a lot to cover. So let's get started.
3, 2, 1, stop. That's one small step for man. Contact with a test one.
So those of you that follow me on Twitter have probably been watching this video come to life and have likely noticed my tone change from Aerospikes suck to a little more neutral stance on the subject. Does this mean I'm maturing? And wow, after literally months of research, this turned out to be a monster. I mean, we ended up going through dozens and dozens of hard to find documents to be able to track down the actual numbers from their sources from some of these original papers back in the 60s. And although it took me a while, the more I learned, the more I realized just how much more I needed to learn and the more context I knew would need to be in this video in order to make it more understandable. So in order to make this more digestible, here's the timestamps of the major topics. And I've got links to those timestamps in the description, and like all my videos, I actually have a full article version up on my website, everydayastronaut.com, if you want to be able to search for certain sections or see some numbers later on. And again, the link's in the description. After I posted my Is SpaceX's Raptor engine the king of rocket engines and Why SSTOs Suck videos, I got so many people claiming that the real holy grail of rockets is actually the Aerospike engine. And you're not wrong. I mean, an engine that magically, thanks to physics, is inherently more efficient at almost any altitude. An engine that works as well at sea level as a perfectly tuned sea level engine bell and still performs just as well in a vacuum as a large vacuum bell. Wow, yes, sign me up. Why isn't there more love for the Aerospike engine in the aerospace industry? I mean, after all, SpaceX engineers tackled the ultimate challenge by developing a methane-powered full flow stage combustion cycle engine. If they could solve that crazy engine, why didn't they try for an Aerospike? Something that promises some pretty substantial gains, and they've already been fully developed. After all, aerospikes definitely aren't new. They actually go all the way back to the 60s when engineers were looking for ways to improve upon some early rocket engines. Now, keep in mind, the engines at this point in time were relatively primitive, so the promise of an Aerospike engine was extra appealing. Perhaps the most notable and promising Aerospike was an Aerospike version of the J2 engine that powered the second and third stage of the Saturn V. This was called the J2T, and on paper, it seemed to be a nice and compact version of the J2, while offering even greater vacuum efficiency than the standard J2. Although it hit the test stand 34 times and had some promising potential, it was shelved alongside the Saturn V and any potential upgrade path thereof once the space shuttle program began. But it was actually considered for use as the space shuttle's main engine. But as we know, NASA went with a closed-cycle Bell-nozzled engine, the RS-25. Rocketdyne also took spare parts from the J2 and the simplified J2S rocket engines and developed a linear Aerospike engine known as the L1 linear testbed from 1970 to 1972. And it had 44 tests with 3,113 seconds of operation. But it'd be almost 30 years before the concept would be dusted off again and looked at with any serious consideration. And this time, it was for a space shuttle replacement known as Venture Star. The Venture Star was a rocket nerd's ultimate dream rocket. A single stage to orbit, or SSTO, fully reusable spaceplane that was to utilize a linear Aerospike engine called the RS-2200 that not only made it look like the Millennium Falcon, but it also promised nearly the same payload capability to low Earth orbit as the space shuttle it was intended to replace. In order to minimize risk, Lockheed Martin began development of a suborbital demonstration version of the Venture Star called the X-33, which was to use a smaller testbed version of the RS-2200 called the XRS-2200. It was fully operational and had accumulated 17 tests and about 1,600 seconds of test stand operations. But because of the overly ambitious use of super advanced carbon composite tanks, a few other technologies that had yet to be perfected, and some interesting politics, Lockheed Martin may have bit off a little more than they could chew. The Venture Star program and the X-33, along with the RS-2200 and the XRS-2200 linear Aerospike engines, were put on the shelf in 2001. Okay, so what the heck? Is the Aerospike just a bad luck engine, being assigned only to programs which were destined to be canceled? Why aren't any of these plans being resurrected now with more modern technologies? Well, let's first get into how they work, and in order to do so, we should probably do a quick overview of how and why a traditional Bell nozzle works, so we know how to compare them against Aerospikes. I mean, after all, the physics are the same between the Aerospike and a Bell nozzle, so let's dive in. Rockets work by taking a high-pressure gas with molecules traveling in all directions and turning that pressure into high-velocity flow in a very specific direction. And if all things are going smoothly, the direction of the flow is exactly opposite of the direction that the rocket is pointing. As we talked about in my video about the Raptor engine, the chamber pressure in rocket engines can be unbelievably high. SpaceX's Raptor engine is currently the king of chamber pressure at 270 bar, and they're aiming for 300 bar. Just to put into perspective how much pressure that is, it's like putting a BMW 740i sedan, which weighs nearly 2 tons, and placing it on something not much bigger than an average size US postage stamp. That's how much pressure is pushing down on every single square inch of the combustion chamber. To convert that pressure, engineers developed something called a converging diverging nozzle, or a de-Lavelle nozzle, that converts those high-pressure gas molecules traveling in all directions to a high-velocity gas moving in one direction. Now we're going to go to Fluid Dynamics City here real quick, and not just any old fluid dynamics, but some super nutty stuff where everything gets backwards and upside down, as we're going to transition from a subsonic high-pressure hot gas into a supersonic, lower pressure and cooler gas. So if our combustion chamber was just a tube coming off the injector, we'd end up with some hot gas moving out pretty fast, but not supersonic. And a fun reminder here about rocket engines and rocket engine efficiency: the faster the exhaust gas is ejected, the better. So in order to accelerate a gas moving through a tube, we can actually shrink the size of the tube. The same volume of gas will pass through this smaller area, and in order to do so, it needs to speed up. I think the best example of this is a standard old garden hose. Turn it on and put your thumb over the end of the hose. Now, ignoring a few potential losses, the same amount of water will flow through the hose regardless of if your thumb is covering the end or not. The only thing that changes is the water has to speed up to move the same volume of water through a smaller hole. Now remove your thumb and the water slows back down. But both methods would actually fill a bucket in the same amount of time. One will just be a lot splashier than the other. So the same thing applies with gas passing through a tube. We can keep shrinking the tube until we get to the point where the gas is traveling at sonic speeds, or the local speed of sound. Now I say local speed of sound because the speed of sound goes up with the square root of temperature. And because temperature in a rocket engine is really high, the speed of sound at the throat can be 5 to 10 times faster than that of room temperature at sea level. Once the exhaust gas is traveling at the speed of sound, we can't actually shrink the tube anymore, because here's where things get quite literally backwards. Once a gas is traveling at the speed of sound, if you shrink the tube anymore, you simply end up choking flow. So from this point on, engineers designed the nozzle to be the perfect shape, which will convert thermal energy into kinetic energy. So as the walls of the nozzle get wider, it actually accelerates the gas, and the pressure and temperature will lower. If you keep going with this and you make the nozzle big enough, you'll get to the point where the exhaust is actually at the same pressure as the ambient air outside, or in the case of sea level, 1 bar of pressure. It's actually kind of amazing to me that we can go all the way from hundreds of bar of pressure down to less than 1 bar in such a relatively short distance. And it's also weird to me that even though the exhaust gas is moving at unbelievable speeds, the exhaust pressure can actually get really, really low. And the lower pressure we can get that exhaust gas, the more we'll have converted high pressure into high gas velocity, which is desirable. But as a rocket climbs in altitude, the ambient air pressure outside of the rocket lowers. So the pressure at the end of the nozzle becomes higher and higher than the ambient air pressure outside of it. You can see a rocket's exhaust plume expanding out in all directions as it ascends into the vacuum of space. This is why vacuum optimized nozzles are so freaking big. The perfect example of this is SpaceX's Merlin engine, which has the same combustion chamber between the sea level version and the vacuum versions. The sea level version with its sea level nozzle is small enough that SpaceX can fit 9 of them inside the 3.7 meter wide Falcon 9. But the upper stage vacuum engine has only 1 engine because the vacuum bell's nozzle is about 3 meters wide. Just look at how snugly it fits inside the inner stage of the Falcon 9. You can tell whether or not a nozzle is optimal for its altitude by looking at the exhaust coming out of the nozzle. A nozzle that's perfectly matching the atmospheric pressure will have exhaust shooting out straight in a perfectly expanded plume or a perfect column of flame. Now, if a nozzle is too small for the altitude it's at, it's called being underexpanded. And you can see the exhaust gas immediately getting wider and wider as soon as it exits the nozzle. If the exhaust gas is traveling away from the rocket at all, that's energy literally being spent thrown out the sides. You want the exhaust traveling as straight as possible. At sea level, nozzles are virtually always too big, and that's called being overexpanded. You can tell when a rocket's nozzle is overexpanded because the exhaust gets squeezed tighter by the ambient air as it exits the nozzle. And it will even form shock waves as pressure grows and expands then compresses again. So now you might be thinking, why don't they just use vacuum optimized nozzles at sea level, since rockets usually get to vacuum-ish conditions within their first minute of flight? Well, there's a few reasons, but first remember, the further away the nozzle exit pressure is from the ambient air pressure, the less efficient it is. So a sea level engine in a vacuum is inefficient, and a vacuum engine at sea level is inefficient. But there's actually another even bigger reason why you can't actually use a vacuum engine at sea level. Because the nozzle would likely break due to something called flow separation. This is where the ambient air squeezes in against the flow of the exhaust and it actually climbs up into the nozzle. And it does this so much that it can create these sudden shock waves and sudden pressure spikes called flow separations, which will most likely damage the nozzle. A nozzle can really only go down to about 40% overexpanded before you get flow separation. Well, that is unless you look at the space shuttle's main engine, the RS-25, which used a unique trick to curl the nozzle walls in ever so slightly, which allowed them to get down to about 14% overexpansion without flow separation at sea level. This allowed them to be very, very overexpanded, which made them more efficient throughout the entire 8.5-minute ascent, since they fired from sea level and they stayed running all the way into orbit. And considering how little amount of time is spent at sea level, maximizing nozzle design for the vacuum of space was definitely a good thing. But for some reason, it's still really weird to think that just regular old air at sea level can be higher pressure and actually squeeze in on rocket exhaust. But the pressure at the tip of the nozzle is actually pretty low. It's just moving very, 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 very fast. And even if you have a huge vacuum nozzle like the Vacuum Merlin 1D, it's still too small for the vacuum of space. If it were to match the ambient vacuum pressure, the nozzle would need to be infinitely long. And since that doesn't sound like it'd be very lightweight or fit inside of our universe, engineers find the happy medium between packaging, mass, and performance. The term for how big the throat of the combustion chamber is compared to the exit of the bell is known as the expansion ratio. This is the ratio between the area of the throat versus the area of the nozzle exit. Again, for ease of reference, let's look at SpaceX's Merlin engine, which has the same chamber and throat diameter, but with different bells. A sea-level Merlin has a nozzle that's 0.91 meters wide, whereas the Merlin vacuum engine has a 2.89 meter wide nozzle. Since both engines have the same throat of 226 millimeters, this means the sea-level Merlin has an expansion ratio of 16:1, while the Merlin vacuum engine has an expansion ratio of 164:1. I think we all tend to look at a rocket engine's nozzle and go, hey, look at that huge rocket engine, when really we're seeing the most insignificant piece of the engine. As a matter of fact, many of the rockets we see on display are missing the actual engines or the turbopumps, and they just have dummy mock-up nozzles. So the next time you hear someone say, check out those huge engines, you can put your glasses up on your nose and say, the final size of the nozzle has only to do with the expansion ratio of the engine bell, and it does not necessarily correspond to the output of the engine. It's kind of like pointing to the wheels of a car and saying, look at that engine, because it's just like how the wheels of a car transmits the energy of the engine to the road. The nozzle converts the energy of the rocket engine into workable thrust. Okay, so you can't really fire a vacuum optimized engine at sea level. And this really is where aerospikes come in. The idea behind aerospikes is you allow the ambient air pressure to actually form the walls containing the flow of the exhaust, so it's always in nearly ideal conditions at any altitude. And not only will you not destroy your engine by lighting it at sea level, it's actually going to perform pretty darn well. And again, I know it doesn't really seem like it because it's just what we're used to, but at sea level there's actually an awful lot of air around us. And you don't really realize how much force it exerts until you remove air from something and you see how much force the atmosphere can actually apply. So with an aerospike, the throat of the combustion chamber, or chambers, aims the exhaust gas at what is essentially just a slice of a traditional bell. When the engine is at sea level, the higher pressure ambient air outside of it pushes the lower pressure exhaust against the wall. So now instead of the ambient air pressure squeezing in on the exhaust and pushing it away from the nozzle wall, the ambient air pushes the exhaust further into the nozzle wall, which makes flow separation physically impossible. As the vehicle climbs in altitude, the ambient air pressure decreases, and so does the pressure on the exhaust flow. This essentially makes the wall that holds the exhaust grow, changing its expansion ratio with altitude. So really the air, or the lack of air, forms the outer wall of the aerospikes, and due to the atmosphere getting thinner and thinner as the rocket's altitude increases, the virtual nozzle actually grows with altitude. But there's still an expansion ratio for aerospike engines, and this is based on how long the spike itself is. The exhaust needs to form against the spike, and once the spike's gone, the exhaust will expand out beyond it in a vacuum, just like a traditional bell. Most aerospike concepts have a flat base at the bottom, or a truncated spike, which takes the turbine exhaust and puts it through a heat exchanger, and that creates a pressure zone in the wake of the rocket that actually adds a little bit of additional thrust in higher altitudes, further aiding in the traits that are considered advantageous. In order to make an aerospike engine, you need a differently shaped combustion chamber than a traditional one, or multiple chambers that form the unique shape needed to make an aerospike. There's two main types of aerospikes. There's the toroidal aerospike and the linear aerospike. With the toroidal aerospike, the combustion chamber is like a donut, kind of, and the throat is an opening pointing inwards-ish towards a spike. A linear aerospike has rows of combustion chambers that all point onto a flatter wedge-shaped ramp and has at least two sides, and the exhaust ends up meeting each other at the tip. Most rocket concepts that utilize an aerospike engine are single stage to orbit concepts, and that is a rocket that is only one stage and goes straight from sea level to orbit with no separation events. Now, I've already done a video on why SSTOs suck. And trust me, they're super cool. Like, yes, I want that, and maybe someday we'll have it, but physics just simply dictates that there's a lot better uses of rockets. I mean, after all, if the key is truly reuse, not putting the entire vehicle through punishing reentry forces is a good place to start. That's why we're seeing fully reusable concept like SpaceX's Starship be a huge multi-stage vehicle. But an Aerospike is a pretty good way to do a single stage to orbit rocket, since you can essentially utilize a vacuum optimized engine at sea level, and not only will it not explode, it'll operate about as well at sea level as a sea level optimized rocket engine. By the math, here's where a working Aerospike can nearly double the payload capacity of an SSTO compared to a good bell nozzled engine. But more on that later when we'll look at whether or not an Aerospike truly is the best option even for SSTOs.